Welcome back to the channel, guys. Now you might be scratching your head seeing the length of this video. Because the amount of material on the channel is growing nicely, I have decided to put together the similarly themed videos in one longer format. So if someone is interested in the German aircrafts, for instance, they don't need to skim through the whole channel to find them. Obviously this is only the first one of these videos, more will come soon covering other nations and of course the ground vehicles too. Over time, as the number of videos will grow on the channel, there will probably be more of these in every topic. So let's jump in and enjoy, guys. Chapter 1. The Messerschmitt Bf 109. Similarly to its greatest rival, the Spitfire, this plane was also developed in the mid-1930s and stayed in service all through during World War II, and even after. In some countries, it was only retired in the 1950s and 1960s. It was the most produced fighter aircraft in history, with more than 34,000 airframes produced until the end of World War II. So let's see how the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was born. In the early 1930s, the German Air Force, just like in most countries, still used biplanes, like the Heinkel HE, but they started a modernization program in 1933. The Reich Air Ministry, RLM in short, outlined 4 future aircraft projects. One for a medium bomber, one for a tactical bomber, one for a single-seat fighter, and one for a 2-seat heavy fighter. The single-seat fighter was planned to be a short-range interceptor to replace the current biplanes in service, the Arado AR 68 and the already mentioned Heinkel HE. The requirements for the new fighter were 400 km/h speed maintained at 6,000 meters and a minimum flight time of 90 minutes. It had to reach the 6,000 meters altitude in no more than 17 minutes and have a service ceiling at 10,000 meters. The minimum armament had to be at least 2 7.92mm machine guns, and the aircraft had to be powered by the Junkers 220 engines, but have provisions to mount the newly developed but not yet ready Daimler DB600 power plant too. 4 companies received development contracts in 1934, Arado, Heinkel and BFW in February, and Focke-Wulf a bit later in September. Originally BFW was not meant to be invited, as Willy Messerschmitt and RLM director Erhard Milch had personal problems, but eventually they got into the competition. The work on the Messerschmitt prototype started right after receiving the contract. It was designed by Willy Messerschmitt and Robert Lasser. The first mock-up was completed in May 1934, and the first prototype was finished a year later in May 1935 and received the designation Bf 109 from the RLM. Before testing could begin, an interesting situation occurred. The prototypes from the manufacturers were done, but none of the German-made engines were ready. So the RLM acquired 4 Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines and gave them to the manufacturers. This led to the strange event that the British Spitfire's main rival in World War II made its maiden flight in late May 1935 while powered by a British Rolls-Royce engine. Later in that year, finally the first UMO engines became available, so the V2 prototype was completed using the German engine. This variant still didn't have any guns though. All 4 participating aircrafts arrived to the trials in February 1936. Arado entered the AR-80 model, Focke-Wulf the FW-159, Heinkel the AG-112, and Messerschmitt the Bf 109 V2 version. It became clear early on that the Arado and Focke-Wulf designs had no chance of winning. The Arado being overweight and slow, while the Focke-Wulf was an obsolete design with its high-mounted wings. For a while the Heinkel design was the favorite because it had lower wing load, better visibility, a more sturdy undercarriage, and it was cheaper than the Bf 109. But in the long run it turned out the Bf 109, thanks to its lower weight, was faster and climbed better, and though its smaller wings resulted in higher wing load and harder landings, they made the fighter more maneuverable. To counter the high wing load, Messerschmitt used high-tech devices on the Bf 109. The automatic leading edge slats and big flaps greatly helped low-speed control. Not long after the competition, in March 1936, the RLM declared the Bf 109 the winner, and this quick decision was helped by the news that the British had put the Spitfire in production in the same year. Now let's take a quick look at the production variants of the Bf 109. The first Bf-109A variant was powered by the UMO 210B engines and was planned to just carry the original two 7.92 machine guns. But after the introduction of the new British fighters, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, each of them carrying 8 machine guns, this was changed. The Bf-109 had very thin wings as they were not designed to carry armament, so it was decided a center-mounted third machine gun or cannon should be used, firing through the center of the engine. The A variants were not mass-produced, as only 22 were built before the next Bf-109B variant arrived in 1937. This variant used the newer UMO 210D engines. Experiences showed that the center-mounted machine guns were very unreliable, so the V8 test version was built to try wing-mounted armament. The results showed the wings need a redesign, as they weren't strong enough to carry armament. 341 were built from the B1 and B2 versions. The following C version was introduced in 1938 and was powered by the new 700 horsepower UMO 210G engine. It featured a redesigned stronger wing with two wing-mounted 7.92 machine guns. Though the C variant had a very short production run of only 58 aircraft, it had several experimental versions. The C3 variant was planned with 20mm cannons in the wings instead of the machine guns, and the C4 variant was meant to feature the center-mounted cannon again. The next D variant was planned to use the Daimler DB600 engines, but the very low number of engines produced meant that the available quantities were used for the Heinkel AG-111 bombers. They were built with the UMO 210D engines instead, and this variant was in service when World War II broke out. 647 D variants were built in total. The first big redesign of the Bf-109 came after the experiences in the Spanish Civil War, and the changes appeared on the E model. These variants received the much stronger Daimler DB601 engines, which produced about 300 more horsepower than the earlier UMO ones. The more powerful engine needed extra cooling, so bigger radiators were installed and they were moved under the wings. The variant also received heavier armament with two 20mm cannons in the wings and two 7.92mm machine guns in the nose, though there were some sub-variants which used different types of armament, such as 4 machine guns or 2 machine guns in the wings and 1 central-mounted cannon. A total of 3,477 E models were built. The following F models had a redesign again after the E variants. They featured the new DB601E engines, producing 1,350 horsepower, and a redesigned airframe with many aerodynamic improvements. The biggest changes included new smoother engine cowlings, a new propeller spinner, new wings with round tips, and a retracting tailwheel. The wing-mounted cannons were gone, instead returned the one center-mounted cannon. Some models featured 15mm and some 20mm ones, and 2 machine guns in the engine cowlings. The F model had a production run of 3,449 units. The following G variant entered service in 1942 and was the last to be mass-produced. This variant featured the even more powerful DB605 engine, developing 1,475 horsepower. From 1943, the 7.92mm machine guns were replaced with 13mm ones. Due to these bigger guns, the later variants, starting with the G5 version, feature very distinctive bulges on the engine cowlings. The G variant was the most numerous of the Bf-109s, with more than 28,000 produced. The H variant was a limited production of high-altitude versions. The wingspan of this variant was increased by more than 6 feet. The final K variant was developed in 1943, when the RLM looked at the confusing arrays of Bf-109 models and instructed Messerschmitt to simplify and come up with a standard model. The K variant introduced in 1944 had many smaller changes, but no major redesign happened. The armament was either similar to the G models, with 2 13mm and 1 20mm cannon, or on some models the 20mm cannon was changed for a 30mm Mk108 model. The new DB605D engine used in this variant had a performance of 1,600 horsepower, making this the fastest Bf-109 variant, with a top speed of 710 km an hour. The Bf-109G model used the Daimler DB605A1 V12 engine, producing 1,475 horsepower. It could reach a maximum speed of 622 km an hour at 8,000 meters, and a cruise speed of 590 km an hour. The plane's service ceiling was 12,000 meters, but being designed as a short-range interceptor, it only had a combat range of around 500 kilometers. The plane's armament consisted of two 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the nose, and one 20mm or 30mm cannon firing through the center of the propeller. Optionally, it could carry 20mm gun pods under the wings. The Bf-109 first saw action in the Spanish Civil War, which the Germans used as a testing ground for the new aircraft. It replaced the aging biplanes during the conflict between 1937 and 1939, and as a more modern aircraft, it dominated the skies against the Soviet-supplied biplanes of the opposing side. Their main opponents in this conflict were the Polikarpov I-15 and I-16 fighters. During the invasion of Poland, the situation was quite similar, as the German Luftwaffe outmatched the poorly trained and equipped Polish Air Force. Though the main Polish fighter aircraft, the PZL P-11, was considered a very good aircraft just a few years before, it was no match to the much more advanced Bf-109. The German fighter still didn't find a match in the Battle of France, as the French MS-406 and D-520, though they were more modern designs, they were not really a match to the Bf-109. They found their challenges, however, during the Battle of Britain, when they had to fight against the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. The main variant used in this battle was the E model, which arrived just in time with its upgraded, more powerful Daimler engines and revised airframe to mount a good challenge to the British fighters. The Spitfire and the Hurricane in general had tighter turning circles and were more nimble, while the Bf-109 had advantages in climbing and diving, and it made good use of its fuel-injected engine against the carburetor-fed British fighters. But built as an interceptor, the short range of the German fighter was a big disadvantage in offensive operations. When escorting bombers, the Bf-109s only had about 10-15 minutes of spare fuel to use in actual combat over Britain before they had to turn back home. Only the later E7 variant fixed this, which had an option to install an outside fuel tank. They had a much easier time on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa and after, against the Soviet Air Force. The Red Air Force was so under-equipped, under-trained and badly organized that the German pilots achieved 21-to-1 ratio, scoring more than 7,300 kills to a loss of 350 aircraft. They were also used in the Mediterranean and in North Africa, fighting together with the Afrika Korps. But in Western Europe, the FW-190 started to replace the Bf-109 from 1942. The fact that the Bf-109 in the beginning mainly fought inferior opponents, then later could attack bomber formations until the Allies introduced the long-range fighter escorts, resulted in some astounding numbers between the Bf-109 pilots. Many of them scored close to or above 200 kills, and Erich Hartmann, the highest scoring ace, claimed 352 downed planes. However, the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range bomber escort ended their air superiority. The Mustang was more than a match to the Bf-109, and after they appeared, the German fighter losses quickly started to mount. Several other countries used the Bf-109 as well, including Bulgaria, Croatia, Finland, Hungary, Italy, Romania, Spain, Switzerland, and Yugoslavia. Some countries used them well after World War II, sometimes the Bf-109's license-built variants. The license-built Avia S-199 was used by the Czech Air Force and Israel, and some of those planes only retired in 1957. The Spanish used some license-built variants up until 1965. The Bf-109 was one of the most successful fighter planes of World War II and the most produced fighter aircraft in history. It was used in all fronts in Europe, and most of the highest scoring German aces collected their victories in this plane. Chapter 2: The Arado AR-234. The plane which only flew at the last year of the war, it was more rare and just as fast as the famous Me-262. though it was not a game changer that late in the war, especially in such low numbers, but its high-tech design and unparalleled speed was quite a shock for the Allies. So let's see how the world's first jet-powered bomber, the Arado AR-234, was developed. The origins of the world's first jet-powered bomber are reaching back to the 1930s, when the first actually usable jet engines started to appear. Even between the two world wars, some engineers were already concerned that even though the aircrafts became more and more advanced, the propeller-driven design will soon reach its maximum potential. Though up until the end of World War II, and even sometime after, the propeller-driven planes became faster and better, it was clear the jet propulsion will be the future. The first jet engine designs were kind of hybrids, where the air compressor was driven by an external piston engine, as opposed to a rear jet engine, where the compressor is driven by the engine itself. A good example for these early hybrid experiments is the Caproni Campini N1. The work on the turbojet engine started in both Germany and in England around the same time. The British Frank Whittle, who already patented the turbojet engine in 1930, was the first who managed to demonstrate an actual working prototype. But in Germany, Hans von Ohain's engine was also running just 6 months after Whittle's. A version of this engine powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE 178, 2 years later, in 1939, not long before the German invasion of Poland and the start of World War II. While at first the new technology didn't find much interest in Britain, the Germans saw a lot of potential in it. Many people think the German jet-powered aircraft were just last-effort weapons because they appeared at the end of the war, but many designs actually started before World War II and were already in advanced stages in the early 1940s. The Heinkel HE 280, which was the first jet-powered fighter plane of the world, was already built by 1940, and only delays in engine development pushed its first flight back to 1942. Or the first operational jet fighter, the Me 262, which was in development since 1939 and already made test flights in 1942. Similarly, the AR-234 development started early in World War II, in late 1940, when the German Ministry of Aviation announced a tender for a new jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft. Interestingly, only the Arado company entered with their E370 project, which was designed under the lead of Walter Bloom. The planned aircraft was a fairly conventional design, with high-mounted straight wings, a sleek aerodynamic fuselage, mounting two UMO 004 engines on the wings. The ministry originally asked for more than 2,000 kilometers of range for the aircraft, and while the Arado design's estimated range was below that, the other qualities were promising, so 2 prototypes were ordered. The estimated maximum speed of the E370 was 780 km an hour, with a service ceiling of 11,000 meters and a range just shy of 2,000 kilometers. The prototypes were finished in less than a year before the end of 1941, but similarly to the other German jet planes, the bottleneck of their development and manufacturing was a delay in the jet engines. The first flight-ready engines for this new plane only arrived 1.5 years later, and the V1 prototype's first flight finally took place in July 1943. Later the same year in October, the second prototype crashed after an engine fire. But when the third prototype was shown to Adolf Hitler, he was so impressed he authorized the company to gear up for large-scale manufacturing of the plane. To maximize fuel capacity and give the plane the intended range, the designers opted to use a similar trolley for takeoffs and skids for landing as on the Me-163 rocket plane. The trolley used for takeoffs was attached to the skids on the aircraft, so the pilot could steer it. After liftoff, the trolley was jettisoned and slowed down by its own brake parachute. The first 5 prototypes were built with this setup. The plan was to use the trolley for takeoffs, and for landings have skids under the fuselage and the engine nacelles. The landings usually went smoothly with the skids, but the pilot had no way of steering or braking after touchdown. The plane also became immobile after stopping, and cannot taxi, so it prevented other aircraft to land or take off until it was recovered. On later models, the skid landing gear was dropped. Instead, they received a retractable tricycle landing gear, and the designers tried other ideas to increase fuel capacity. One was the conventional external fuel tanks, suspended under the engines. The other attempted solution was anything but conventional. The engineers designed a flying fuel tank for the plane, which was towed behind and carried additional fuel for the flight. The 6th and 8th prototypes were fitted with 4 BMW engines instead of the UMO ones. They both featured different configurations though. The 6 had the 4 engines mounted individually, while the 8 had them in twin nacelles on both wings. In 1942, the Air Ministry asked Arado to design a bomber version of the plane, so the V7 prototype was used for developing that variant. Though it sounds good to have a very fast jet bomber, the Arado was not the best choice for that. It was a small aircraft, only 12.6 meters long, with a 14.4 meters wingspan. The width of the fuselage varied between 1.4 and 1.9 meters and was filled mostly with fuel tanks and a crammed one-man cockpit. The V9 and V10 were the prototypes for the AR-234B, the bomber version, and the first ones to feature the final retractable landing gear setup. Since the plane's small fuselage had no space for internal bomb bays, the bombs were carried on external racks, under the engines and the fuselage, but this greatly improved drag and reduced the speed of the aircraft. The V13 had 4 BMW engines, similarly to the V8 version, but featured the retractable landing gear setup. This variant was the base for the AR-234C version. The V16 was a development model to test the new swept crescent wings. The wings were tested in the wind tunnel, and they were actually constructed, but never fitted on the plane. The AR-234A was the first proposed production variant, still featuring the skid-type landing gear. The B1 variant was a reconnaissance version. It was used to take pictures after the Normandy landings in August 1944. While the B2 became the bomber version, which could carry a maximum of 1,500 kilograms of bomb load. During the test flights, the V9 prototype reached 672 km an hour maximum speed, while carrying 3 500-kilogram bombs. When carrying the maximum payload, rocket boosters were often used under the wings to help with the takeoff. 2 planes from the B2 versions were converted to night fighters, featuring the Neptune radar and 20mm cannons. In February 1945, production switched to the C models, which used 4 BMW engines, so the UMO engines will free up for the Me-262 production. They also featured a redesigned cockpit. The C1 became the reconnaissance version, while the C2 the bomber version. There was also a C3 variant, mounting 2 20mm cannons under the nose. There were numerous proposed designs which never went to production as the war ended. Some of them were quite interesting. One idea proposed to carry a V1 flying bomb on top of the aircraft and there launch it against Allied targets, or tow it behind the aircraft like the earlier mentioned flying fuel tank proposal. Another idea was mounting a microfighter under the fuselage, which the mother aircraft would carry near Allied bomber formations to attack them. Now let's see the general technical specifications of the most common B2 variant. As we mentioned earlier, the AR-234, all things considered, was a very small plane. It was 12.6 meters long, with a wingspan of 14.4 meters. It was powered by 2 UMO 004 turbojet engines, or 4 BMW engines on the C variants. The plane could reach a maximum speed of 742 km an hour at 6,000 meters, and had a cruise speed of 700 km an hour. The later C variant was even faster. It could reach 870 km an hour. It had a range of 1,556 km with a full bomb load, and a service ceiling of 10,000 meters. The plane had a maximum bomb load of 1,500 kilograms. The usual loadout was either 2 500 kilogram bombs under the engines or one 1,000 kilogram bomb under the fuselage. Optionally, it could carry an unpowered bomb torpedo, the BT-1400. The AR-234 had lots of trouble getting into operational status, as even though it was ready by 1944, the German war industry was crippled by that time by Allied bombings. The shortage of resources led to drop in quality in manufacturing, which hit especially hard the sensitive jet engines. The engines usually required rebuilding after just 10 hours of operation, and even when they were available, the lack of fuel grounded many aircraft. The first mission of the AR-234 was conducted in August 1944, flying reconnaissance over the Allied positions in Normandy and collecting information over England. Later in that year, the B variant started to arrive to the units, and they flew bombing missions against Antwerp and Brussels. They flew missions against Allied targets in the Battle of the Bulge, and some of them attacked Bastogne in January 1945. Their most numerous and famous mission was trying to bomb the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen when the Allies captured it. For more than a week the Germans tried to demolish the bridge, with bombing missions including the AR-234s and V-2 rocket strikes. The jet bombers flew missions up until the end of the war, though many of them were grounded because lack of fuel. The speed of these new aircrafts was a surprise to the Allies, as no Allied fighter could catch them unless they made a turn and dropped their speed. But soon the Allied pilots started to use the same tactics against them as they did against the Me-262 and the Me-163, and attacked them during landing or taking off when they were vulnerable. At the end of the war, several of these planes were captured by the Allies. 3 of them, together with other aircraft, were transported to the US aboard HMS Reaper during Operation Lusty. Today only one surviving plane is known, which is on display at the Smithsonian. Chapter 3. The Focke-Wulf FW-190. This plane was one of the highest performing World War II fighter aircraft, and when it appeared in the Western Front in 1941, it outperformed every Allied fighter for at least a year. This was the Focke-Wulf FW-190, or the Butcher Bird as they called it. So let's see the history and development of these planes, and how they performed in the war. In the mid-1930s, the German Luftwaffe started a modernization program, as similarly to many other countries around the globe, they still used biplanes for many roles. So the Reich Air Ministry, RLM in short, set out specifications for new fighter planes. In the first competition, Messerschmitt entered with the Bf 109, Arado with the AR 80, Heinkel with the HE 112, and Focke-Wulf entered their FW 159 aircraft. In this competition, the Arado and Focke-Wulf designs were quickly dropped out, and the Bf 109 was the final winner, ahead of the Heinkel HE 112. Though the competition was won by the Bf 109, this was not the end of the modernization of the German Air Force, as even though the HE 112 came in second, it didn't spark interest in the ministry or the Luftwaffe, so it didn't go into large-scale production. The Germans, however, wanted another fighter plane to be available alongside the Bf 109. So a new tender was announced in 1937. This time Focke-Wulf entered a more modern design, and that was the plane that became the FW-190. As the 190 design used a radial engine, it didn't compete for the inline engines with the Bf-109. On the other hand, radial engines were not widely used in fighters in Europe at that time, as the general thinking was the large engines will cause a lot of drag. The problem with the air-cooled radial engines were that in the past most of the engine had to be left exposed, so the airflow can cool it, but this caused a huge amount of drag, or if the engine was covered with more aerodynamic cowlings, they were prone to overheat. But the team at Focke-Wulf, with the lead of Kurt Tank, worked around this problem. Tank had already seen how in the US they used big radial engines for fighter planes, and worked out solutions against the overheating of the engine. Initially, the design used the BMW 139 radial engine, and the large engine in the relatively small aircraft caused the cockpit to heat up to as high as 55 degrees Celsius. To prevent overheating but still cover the engine in a streamlined body, a large cooling fan was used behind the propeller. The first prototype used a huge spinner and very tight cowlings to cool the engine, But this didn't bring the results the design team hoped for, so it was soon changed to a more conventional design. The original BMW 139 engine, however, was not used for long, as even before the first flight of the V1 prototype, BMW was testing their new engine, the 801. This engine was much more powerful than the 139 and similar in diameter, but it was much heavier and longer, so it required the airframe to be redesigned. The Air Ministry convinced Focke-Wulf to switch to the new engine, and because of this, several earlier prototypes were abandoned, and the V5 became the first one featuring the new bigger engine. The modified airframe had to be longer to accommodate the bigger engine, resulting in the cockpit move more back, which on top of balancing out the bigger engine, solved the cockpit overheating problem and also provided space to install armament in the nose. The new engine's oil coolers were also moved to the front of the nose around the cooling fan and were placed in an armored ring. The FW190 design used several modern features of the time. It had a very wide track landing gear, which was praised by the pilots, as it was much sturdier and stable than the narrow track landing gear of the Bf109s. Also, contrary to most aircrafts of the time, the 190 didn't use cables for the controls, which tend to stretch over time. It used push rods and bearings, which made the feel of the controls more consistent. The plane also featured electric motors for the landing gears instead of hydraulics, and on the engine used a complex automated control system, the so-called commando garage, or command device, which automatically set the mixture, propeller pitch, boost and timing, essentially allowing the pilot to just move the throttle lever and leave the rest to the control device. As advanced as it was, of course this type of automatic control was not perfect, and sometimes surprised the pilots. The test flights of the V5 prototype with the new engine went fairly smoothly, and the aircraft proved to be very fast and maneuverable. In August 1940, the prototype collided with a vehicle on the ground, and while in the factory for repairs, it received new wings as well, with larger surface area. Though these bigger wings reduced the top speed by about 10 km an hour, they gave the aircraft more maneuverability and a better climb rate. By November 1940, an order was placed for 30 pre-production aircraft. These featured 6 7.92mm machine guns, and they entered service in March 1941 to be tested on the field. Their continuous engine problems, though, led to an investigation to the program, and the RLM only approved their full deployment after some 50 modifications. The FW190 had more than 30 different variants for different specifications, so we will not look at each of them in detail, just the main versions. In general, the A version was the most produced and used in greatest numbers, the variants ranging from A1 to A9. These models during their service were continuously developed, receiving stronger engines, and their armament was upgraded as well, going from the initial 7.92mm machine guns to 13mm ones, then 20 and 30mm cannons. Some models even carried grenade launchers and bombs. The 190 was a very fast and maneuverable fighter at low and medium altitudes, but its performance dropped significantly above 20,000 feet. This was not a big concern in the early service life of the aircraft, but later in the war, as the air battles were fought at higher altitudes, high altitude improvements were needed for the FW190. There were several options considered by Focke-Wulf and the RLM. The FW190B version, featuring turbocharger on the BMW 801 engine, the FW190C version, using a turbocharged Daimler DB603 engine, and the FW190D version with the turbocharged UMO 213 engines. Since the B models would use the same engine as the A version, the airframe didn't need any big modifications, but it received a pressurized cockpit with heated canopy. Several A-model aircraft were modified to test the viability of this version, but soon the attention turned towards the C variant instead. These variants, featuring the Daimler DB603 engine, needed more modifications. One of them was the lengthening of the tail, as the engine shifted the center of gravity forward. They featured a turbocharger below the aircraft together with the air intake. As the 190 was not a huge aircraft, the supercharger and its piping couldn't fit in the fuselage. In the end, these variants were found unreliable, and the added weight negated the performance upgrades. The D models featuring the UMO 213 engines were even more extensively modified. To maintain the balance of the aircraft, both the nose and the tail were made longer. But to try to keep the modifications to the minimum, the D models used a ring radiator in front of the engine, making the aircraft look like it still used a radial engine. Though this fighter kept the original wingspan, with the added weight it was overall less maneuverable, but was faster and became a very effective medium-altitude interceptor. Though above 20,000 feet, the performance still fell short to the Allied fighters. The final high-altitude version developed from the FW-190 was the TA-152, but we will take a look at those planes in a later video. The F variants were developed to be used in the ground attack role. These featured additional armor at the bottom of the fuselage, around the cockpit, the fuel tanks, and the armament. They were equipped with bomb racks under the fuselage and later under the wings as well. The G version was built as a long-range variant. These featured additional oil tanks for the engine and could carry external fuel tanks under the wings. The armament was reduced to save weight and make space for the oil tanks. These variants were very versatile, as they could carry either fuel tanks or bombs or gun pods under the wings, or basically any variations of those. Some did feature the additional armor introduced on the F versions, some didn't. The Focke-Wulf 190 was not a big plane, with a length of 9 meters and a wingspan of 10.5 meters. It used the BMW 801D engine, producing 1700 horsepower. With this engine, the fighter's maximum speed was 652 km an hour, and it had a maximum range of around 1000 km. The service ceiling was 10,300 meters. The plane's armament consisted of two 13mm machine guns and four 20mm cannons. Additionally, it could carry a bomb under the fuselage. The Focke-Wulf 190 first appeared in August 1941, and at that time proved to be the best fighter on the Western Front. At medium and low altitudes, it outperformed all Allied fighter planes. The Spitfire Mark Vs had better turning radius, but in every other aspect they were inferior to the 190. The Allies actually were totally unaware of the new German fighter, and when the first reports arrived about the new radial engine fighter, they put it down as P-36 fighters, which the Germans captured from the French Air Force. Later it became clear the Germans deployed a new and powerful fighter plane, and slowly Allied aircraft losses started to rise, as no Allied fighter plane could catch the FW-190 at low altitudes. The Focke-Wulf 190 gave the Germans air superiority over Western Europe for about a year. The Allies became so desperate to study the new aircraft, they planned a raid on a German airfield to steal one. They were hard-pressed to come up with something against the 190, as the Germans also started using the fighter bomber versions over southern England, and these attacks were very hard to counter. Unlike the normal German bombing raids, which were picked up by the radar and the ground observers, these low-altitude high-speed attacks came with no warnings. The British pressed the Hawker Typhoon into service in late 1941, as at that time that was the only aircraft fast enough at low altitudes to catch the new German plane. In June 1942, luck played in the Allies' hand. They managed to capture an intact 190 when its pilot mistook the Bristol Channel for the English Channel and landed at a British airfield by mistake. After studying the aircraft, they pressed the Spitfire Mark 9 into service, which after summer 1942 again leveled the playfield. Later, the Focke-Wulf 190s were heavily used during the Normandy campaign after the Allied landings, both in ground attack role and against Allied aircraft, though against the overwhelming Allied air superiority, they suffered very heavy losses. As the Allied bombing raids became more frequent over Germany, the 190s were modified for anti-bomber operations, as their heavy armor and capability to carry heavy armament seemed perfect for the role. Many of them had their 20mm cannons swapped for the Mk108 30mm ones, and some variants carried rockets as well. But all these modifications made the aircraft even heavier and less maneuverable. And they actually needed lighter escort fighters themselves, usually Bf-109s, to keep the Allied fighter escort away from them. Though these formations not always worked as intended, when they did, the heavily armed 190s caused heavy losses on the bombers. This resulted in the increase in Allied operations against German airfields, to take out as many aircrafts on the ground as possible. The Focke-Wulf 190 appeared on the Eastern Front later, in late 1942. On this front, as most of the fighting was conducted at medium and low altitude, the 190s were very effective, many of their pilots collecting above 50 kills, some of them well over 100. They were also more suited to the muddy airfields on the Eastern Front than the Bf-109 with its narrow track landing gear, and they could take more damage and still return from combat. Due to the low altitude nature of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the aircraft were constantly exposed to the anti-aircraft fire, so the armor plating on the 190s and the more robust air-cooled engine was very much appreciated by the pilots. Thanks to their performance, they could usually gain control of the air against Soviet planes. But as the Wehrmacht was pushed back by the Red Army on the ground, and the Stuka dive bombers became increasingly less effective, the 190s were pushed into ground attack role more and more often. Over time, as the Red Air Force was built back and more advanced Soviet aircraft appeared, their advantage started to melt away. They were still effective, but their numbers started to diminish, and the lack of fuel caused problems as well. The Focke-Wulf 190 saw combat in North Africa as well, although they arrived quite late at the theater, flying their first combat mission in November 1942. As in other theaters, the 190 again proved itself as a capable fighter and effective against ground targets as well, attacking Allied airfields, harbors, and other ground installations. They couldn't prevent the Allied victory in North Africa though, and after the German withdrawal, they flew missions from Sicily and Italy. Chapter 4: The Heinkel HE 280. Almost everyone knows the Messerschmitt Me 262 as the first operational jet fighter aircraft developed during World War II in Germany. But the Me 262 was not the first jet fighter in history. There was another plane developed at the same time and flew before the Messerschmitt one, but it fell victim to technical problems, lack of resources, and political decisions. This was the Heinkel HE 280. So let's see how this historical aircraft was developed and why it didn't go to large-scale production. Let's first take a look how the jet engine development gained momentum between the two world wars, and what led to the development of the jet fighter aircrafts. The limited efficiency of the propeller was a concern for engineers well before World War II. And that meant the propeller-driven planes will reach their limits fairly soon. The experiments with jet engines started back in the 1920s, though the propeller-driven planes were getting faster and better all the way until the end of World War II. While in a modern real jet engine the compressor is driven by the engine itself, in the early prototype jets the compressor was driven by a separate piston engine. These hybrid engines were called motorjets. A good example of these early hybrid experiments is the Caproni Campini N1, which started development in 1934. Frank Whittle, the man known as the pioneer of the jet engine, drew up his first idea in 1928 and patented it in 1930. About the same time, when Frank Whittle was working on his turbojet engine in Britain, there were similar experiments in Germany by Hans von Ohain. He was working on his jet engine project through the 1930s and finished the first test run in September 1937, just a few weeks after Whittle's engine. Ohain's engine followed a centrifugal design, contrary to the later Junkers Jumo and BMW jets, which were axial designs. The centrifugal design allowed for an overall smaller engine, but the output of them were below the expectations. In 1936, Ohain had a meeting with Heinkel engineers after approaching the company with his plans, and managed to convince them that with enough resources, the engine can be refined and used in mass production. So from April 1936, Ohain started working for Heinkel to develop his jet engine design further. A version of his engine powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE-178, in August 1939, just a few weeks before the invasion of Poland. Encouraged by the successful test, the Germans started working on the idea of an advanced combat aircraft powered by jet engines. Though the Heinkel jet flight was a milestone in aviation, it didn't spark much interest in the RLM. As later turned out, the ministry already started their own jet project. A big part in this negativity towards Heinkel's work came from his differences with some high-ranking Nazis, and because he often criticized the regime. While Willy Messerschmitt, on the other hand, was popular in the party. Despite no backing from the state, Heinkel started working on a new high-speed fighter aircraft, featuring O-Heinz engine. This is the aircraft which became the AG-280. The design team under the lead of Robert Lasser, who was a co-designer of the famous Bf-109, set to work in late 1939, and they made good use of the data and experience gathered with the AG-178, though the design of that plane was not developed further. It was a good proof of concept for jet propulsion, but it was not suitable for a high-speed fighter plane. The design of the new aircraft was similar to the Me-262 in a sense that it mounted the engines under the wings, but the design itself was fairly conventional, featuring straight semi-elliptical wings and a twin tail. Later the V8 prototype was tested with a very unique V-shaped tail design. The AG-280 featured a tricycle landing gear from the beginning, which initially met some resistance, as many thought this kind of landing gear is too fragile for the airfields. But as it turned out, they were wrong. Though it was a conventional design, the AG-280 had one very new device on it. It was the very first plane to feature an ejection seat, which was powered by compressed air. The first airframes were ready by summer 1940, but the engine development was lagging behind. The aircraft was planned to use Hans von O-Heinz design, but as most jet engine development at that time, they encountered problems. Because of this, until early 1941, the test flights were performed in glider mode. The AG-280 was 34 feet 1.5 inches long, with a wingspan of 40 feet. It had an empty weight of 7,073 pounds, and it was powered by two AGS-8A turbojet engines. With these engines it could maintain 510 miles an hour and reach 560 miles an hour for short periods of time. It had a range of 400 miles and an estimated service ceiling of 37,700 feet. The planned armament was 3 MG-151 20mm cannons. Finally, at the end of March 1941, the engines were ready and the first powered flight happened. This flight made the AG-280 the first jet fighter aircraft in the world, as the Me-262 only performed its first jet-powered flight in July 1942. The plane handled well, and the prototypes had several test flights in the coming year. But the engines were still troublesome and not powerful enough. In January 1943, one of the prototypes was tested to use fast jet engines from the WWII rockets. But the test didn't end well. Because of the bad weather, the control surfaces iced up and the plane crashed. The test pilot had to use the ejector seat, becoming the first ever pilot using such a device. Over the following year, the progress on the development was slow and mainly spent on refining the engines. Finally, at the end of December 1942, the AG-280 demonstrated itself with the refined engines against Focke-Wulf 190s, and it proved to be a lot faster than the propeller-driven fighters. The RLM after this demonstration finally showed some interest in the fighter, and placed an order for 20 pre-production aircraft. But the engine problem still delayed the Heinkel project. In 1942, the RLM instructed Heinkel to cease work on the existing engines, as they were too underpowered, and concentrate on the new model, the AGS-11, which was an interesting design, combining axial and centrifugal compressor elements. As the new engine's development was even more complicated than its predecessors, in 1943 the V6 prototype was tested with UMO jet engines, and worked well enough, but the UMO engines were much bigger and heavier than the ones the plane was designed for, so this prototype was much slower than the Me-262. As it seemed the Heinkel engines will not be in production anytime soon, Finally, in March 1943, Heinkel was ordered to stop the project, as the ministry didn't want two competing designs for the limited number of jet engines. The Heinkel AG-280 was one of the history's almost happened vehicles. It could have been a good aircraft and maybe even get in service earlier than the Messerschmitt Me-262, but the development troubles, the time wasted on the engines, and the politics in the Air Ministry finally put an end to its short history. Chapter 5. The Junkers Ju-87. There was a plane in World War II which was considered obsolete even when the war broke out, but still it became one of the symbols of the war, and stayed in service all along until the very end. Its shape, and especially its sound, are maybe the most notorious signs of the early war years and the success of the German forces over Europe. So let's see the history of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Let's clear up the naming of the aircraft first. The Stuka is a short version for Sturzkampfflugzeug, literally meaning dive attack aircraft, which was used to every dive bombing aircraft, but later the shortened version became synonymous with the Ju-87. Also worth mentioning that the whistling bomb sound, well known to everyone from war movies, is also connected to the Stuka dive bombers. The Germans sometimes fitted whistles on the bomb fins, either as an alternative to the Jericho trumpet or used together with them. Normal bombs of course don't whistle, but the Stuka bombs often did. Now after this little detour, let's get on with the origins of the Ju-87 and the dive bombing as a principle itself. Though dive bombers are most well known from the Second World War, mostly because of the Stuka in Europe and the American and Japanese use in the Pacific, the dive bombing was not a new concept at that time. Its origins reach back to the First World War, when it was first tried by the British Royal Flying Corps. They found the bombing from their planes very inaccurate and encouraged their pilots to dive towards the target to get a better aim. This was a very dangerous task in an open cockpit of a wooden cloth biplane, which usually became the target of every gun on the ground. The British later ordered purpose-built planes for this role, the Sofit TF-2 Salamander, which was designed for ground attack role. These planes featured armor plating around the cockpit and fuel tanks, but they were not designed as dive bombers yet. After the First World War, many countries experimented with the dive bombers and their use and tactics. Though the dive bombing promised much more accuracy, the dangers to the plane and the pilot were much higher during the low-level dives. The RAF concluded tests with different planes, and though the bombing results were promising, they considered the danger to the aircrews too high. At the same time in the US, Billy Mitchell organized a series of bombing tests on old battleships. They tried several different tactics, including dive bombing, using Royal Aircraft Factory SE-5 dive bombers. In Germany, Ernst Udet, a famous pilot, was advocating dive bombing between the two world wars, and it was him who pushed the Ju-87 project forward. He became a fan of the concept after he observed some Curtiss Hawk dive bombers in the US. Since Germany couldn't afford to build a large fleet of heavy bombers, and under the Versailles Treaty they were not allowed to, so they were interested in the dive bomber concept, which allowed smaller single-engine bombers to destroy targets with much greater accuracy. Not everyone was enthusiastic about developing these kinds of dive bombers though. Wolfram from Richthofen, the head of development, didn't like the idea. He thought the planned planes were underpowered and slow. He envisioned some much more powerful twin-engine planes for the role, which could flee enemy fighters if needed. And with that we arrive to the development of the Ju-87. To learn how the Stuka was developed, we need to go back a bit in time. The story starts in 1924, when Junkers, to avoid the restrictions on German aircraft development after World War I, supported the founding of a company in Sweden, the AB Flyg Industry, which was basically the subsidiary of Junkers, but outside the control of the Versailles Treaty. Here, amongst other planes, they developed the purpose-built dive bomber, the K-47, originally for a request from Turkey. This was a two-seat open-cockpit conventional monoplane, heavily braced, to withstand the forces of the dive bombing role. This aircraft first flew in 1929, but eventually the Turkish government lost interest. Nonetheless, the experiences collected in the design helped Junkers in designing a new aircraft for the dive bomber role, the one which will later become the Ju-87. The development of the aircraft actually started in 1933, still in Sweden. and later the first prototype was shipped to Germany and finished there before its first flight in September 1935. The timing was quite fortunate for Junkers, as the RLM decided in April 1935 to set new specifications for a dive bomber program. 4 companies, Arado, Blohm & Voss, Heinkel and Junkers, were requested to enter their designs. Junkers with the Ju-87 already had a head start in front of the other companies, as they only needed a few months to finish their prototype. The 4 proposed planes were the Blohm & Voss AJ-137, the Heinkel AG-118, the Arado AR-81 model, and finally the Junkers Ju-87. From the 4 designs, the AJ-137 was dropped out first. Though it seemed a very good performing plane, the RLM wanted a rear gunner in their dive bomber, and this was a single-seater aircraft. Even though Junkers had a head start with their development, their work was not really as smooth as one would think. You might have already noticed something strange on the Ju-87 prototype picture, but if you haven't, look at it again. The original V1 prototype featured a twin-tail design, carried over from the K-47, which used it to give the rear gunner a better field of fire. But as it turned out, the twin-tail caused fluttering dives, and because of that the prototype crashed in January 1936. Because of this, the tail section on the V2 prototype was redesigned and received a conventional single-fin tail. Junkers also had to modify the power plant, as the original prototype was planned to use the Rolls-Royce Castrol engines, but that was unacceptable for the RLM. Junkers proposed to change it to a Daimler DB601 and planned the final variant to use the UMO 210 engine. The competitive testing of the 3 remaining aircraft started in March 1936. It became clear early on that the Arado AR-81 with its conventional biplane design won't be a contender. The Heinkel and the Junkers were the 2 planes to decide between. The Ju-87 was a much simpler and sturdier design, while the Heinkel a more sleek and advanced one, featuring an internal bomb bay and retractable landing gears. The 2 different views on the dive bombers clashed again, as Richthofen supported the Heinkel design, while Udet preferred the Ju-87. As Richthofen was the head of development in the Luftwaffe Technical Service, and he liked the Heinkel plane, on June 9, 1936, the RLM notified Junkers to cease the development of the Ju-87, as the Heinkel design will be the winner. Interestingly, just the next day, Richthofen was promoted to Chief of Staff of the Condor Legion. He was transferred to Spain, and Udet was moved into his seat as head of development. His first order was to notify Junkers to continue with the project. In the next month, he personally flew the Heinkel prototype in a test. When he went in a dive, the engine oversped and the propeller broke away. The plane crashed, but Udet bailed out and landed safely. Though Heinkel insisted they warned him to adjust the propeller before diving, he announced the Ju-87 as the winner of the competition. The plane was accepted to service, and with that we have arrived to the variants of the Stuka. The first A variant was powered by the UMO 210 12-cylinder engine, producing 600 horsepower, and it was a very underpowered aircraft. This variant could only carry a single 250 kg bomb, or a 500 kg one if the rear gunner was not on board. The A version is easy to recognize from the large trousers on the gear legs and the dual radio masts. They were planned to receive 4 7.92mm machine guns in the wings, but because of the weight increase, this was decreased to only 2. The following B variant brought a lot of improvements, a completely redesigned airframe, landing gear, and a new UMO 211 engine with twice the performance, producing 1200 horsepower. This variant featured a sloped nose, simpler landing gear design, and a single radio mast. With the more powerful engine, this version was able to carry a 500 kg bomb together with the crew. This version was the first to feature the signature Jericho trumpets. The C variant was not a straightforward evolution, but a specialized version built for the Navy. It was meant to be used on the planned Graf Zeppelin aircraft carrier, and showed many different features accordingly: a catapult attachment, landing hook, folding wings, a jettisonable landing gear, and flotation devices under the wings. This variant was cancelled when the work on the aircraft carrier stopped. The R version had a very low production run, and these were built for long-range operation, mainly to be used against shipping. They were basically identical to the B models, except an additional oil tank and extra fuel lines in the wings, allowing the use of external drop tanks. Because of the added weight, they were restricted to carry only one 250 kg bomb. The D version featured a lot of upgrades, again a new more powerful 1400 horsepower engine, a redesigned airframe, a more streamlined nose, and a redesigned and more aerodynamic canopy. The new engine allowed the installation of more armor plating and a new double machine gun on the rear. This version also featured the same drop tank option that was introduced with the R model. They could carry a 1000 kg bomb under the fuselage, or optionally even an 1800 kg one, but only for short ranges. Under the wings, it could either carry small 50 kg bombs, or optionally gun pods. The last G variant was basically reinvented in a new role. The Stuka by 1943 was not very effective anymore, and the Germans needed a tank hunter aircraft on the Eastern Front. So these variants were equipped with 37mm anti-tank guns under the wings. To protect the aircrew, the engineers copied the armor plating from the Soviet IL-2 attack planes. The G variant was not a new design, they were rebuilt from D airframes for this purpose. Now let's see the technical specifications of the Ju-87D variant. The D variant used the UMO 211J V12 engine, producing 1400 horsepower. It could reach a maximum speed of 410 km an hour and had a cruise speed of 319 km an hour. The plane's operational range was 1500 km and had a service ceiling of 7300 meters. Its armament consisted of two 7.92mm machine guns in the wings and double 7.92 machine guns in the rear. It could carry a maximum of 1800 kg of bomb load, but the usual loadout was between 500 and 1000 kg. The Stuka made its debut in the Spanish Civil War with the Condor Legion, though only a few of them were shipped to Spain to be tested in real combat. They proved to be very accurate against their targets, and they were considered so top secret that not even Spanish ground crews were allowed near them. The experiences gathered there helped to develop the Ju-87 further. In the invasion of Poland, most of them were expected to do their part, but just a few weeks before the start of the Polish campaign, an incident cast a shadow on the Stuka reputation. In August 1939, during a training exercise while they were practice dive bombing, almost all the participating planes were lost. Because of the unexpectedly low cloud cover, they all crashed to the ground, as when they were breaking out of the clouds, they found themselves at very low altitude. But the doubts about the plane's performance quickly disappeared after the invasion of Poland, as the Stuka again proved to be very effective and accurate. They roamed the skies freely, as the German fighters protected them from the opposition. The Stukas destroyed trains and bombed the Polish infantry at will, and they sank most of the Polish navy in the first few days of the war. They were key elements of the German blitzkrieg, as the fast-moving armored forces could call on them anytime they needed help. Some Ju-87s took part in the invasion of Norway as well, where they proved to be devastating against the Royal Navy. They sank 3 destroyers and a support ship in this operation. Later in 1940, during the Battle of France, the Stuka again proved its worth, being just as useful as in the invasion of Poland. And just like before, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, so they battered the French and British forces at will. During the Battle of Dunkirk, the Luftwaffe damaged or sank more than 100 civilian and military ships as they tried to evacuate the Allied forces from the harbor, most of them credited to the Ju-87s. This was the high point for the Stuka, and the reason their image is forever tied to the success of the German blitzkrieg. But nothing lasts forever. Soon after, during the Battle of Britain, it became clear that the slow and vulnerable Ju-87 is easy prey for enemy fighters if the German Air Force is not in complete control of the skies. They were withdrawn from the operation just after a month, as their losses started to mount. However, they still found a lot of success over the Mediterranean and on the Balkans, where they could operate with relative safety. They attacked British convoys on their way to Africa and Malta. Their biggest target was the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. It came under heavy attack in January 10, 1941, and received 6 direct bomb hits, but managed to get away, no small thanks to her armored flight deck. They also saw action in Greece and Yugoslavia, where again they could operate with almost no resistance in the air, and they delivered great blows to the enemy ground forces. During the Battle of Crete, the Germans again were held back by the British naval forces, and again it was the job for the Stukas to deal with the Royal Navy ships. In the span of 3 days, they managed to sink or damage at least 10 British ships. After the Allies retreated from South Europe, the Ju-87s were used in North Africa as well, helping Rommel's Africa Corps. Initially they were successful here too, but as the Allied air power got stronger in the area, the tide slowly turned. The situation got worse when the US forces arrived as well. By 1943 the Allies ruled the skies over North Africa, and the Stuka losses quickly started to mount, as they had little cover from the German fighters. On the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Stuka again proved to be devastating, as the Soviet Air Force was scattered and mostly destroyed by the Luftwaffe, so they could fly without much opposition from the enemy fighters. They were free to attack trains, supply lines, and the Soviet Navy ships. But the Soviet Air Force was quickly rebuilt, and by 1943 the Stuka couldn't enjoy complete freedom, and they started to lose a lot of aircraft, as they were pushed into more and more action trying to stop the Red Army's advance. By the last years of the war, the Stuka numbers were reduced, many of them were replaced by Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, and the fuel shortages also grounded many aircraft. The few remaining Ju-87s were in use until the end of the war. In fact, one of the last German propaganda films showing an anti-tank G version shooting at Soviet tanks just outside Berlin in the last weeks of the war. The Ju-87 Stuka was considered obsolete by many even before World War II, but still it became one of the key to the German successes, and it is forever will be a symbol of this war. Chapter 6. The Heinkel HE 111. This aircraft, though it was not the most advanced and not even the most successful of the German World War II bombers, is still widely known. Its distinctive shape reminds most people immediately of World War II and the Battle of Britain. So today we will take a look at the history and development of this interesting plane. The roots of the Heinkel HE 111 reach back to the early 1930s, when Heinkel developed a fast passenger and mail carrier plane, the HE-70 Blitz, or Lightning. This was a single-engine aircraft, but already carried many of the features that later appeared on the 111 design, like the elliptical wings and streamlined fuselage. The Heinkel HE-70 was operated by the Luftwaffe as a light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, and the design sparked interest for many in the Air Force. In 1933, Albert Kessering, the head of the Luftwaffe administration, visited Heinkel and convinced him to move his company to Rostock and start working on a new medium bomber. As many other vehicles at that time in Germany, this bomber was developed under the disguise of being a civilian aircraft, as Germany under the Versailles Treaty was not allowed to build an air force. Because of this, the aircraft was advertised as a fast airliner, and in fact the first variants actually went to civilian use, carrying passengers, while the Luftwaffe held trials on the military variants. The new 111 was designed by Siegfried and Walter Günther under the disguise of a fast airliner, and kept many features from the earlier HE-70. The round fuselage, elliptical wings, and rounded control surfaces. But this new aircraft was a twin-engine design. Though the HE-111 is most well known for its stepless cockpit design, that was only introduced at the late 111P variants. The models before that featured a much more conventional cockpit arrangement. The first prototype made its maiden flight in February 1935 and proved to be a stable and easy-to-fly aircraft, though the maximum speed was lacking thanks to the underpowered BMW engines only producing 650 horsepower. The Luftwaffe held comparison trials later that year against the Junkers Ju-86 bomber. The performance of the two was fairly similar, even with the HE111 using the BMW engines. When later the V5 prototype arrived, using the stronger Daimler engines, it clearly had an advantage over the Junkers design. Still in the same year, in 1935, the V2 and V4 prototypes were produced for civilian market. They entered service with the Lufthansa in 1936, and they were announced by the media as the fastest passenger aircraft, as they could reach 400 km an hour. But this performance was inflated, as in reality the maximum speed was around 360 km an hour. They were capable of carrying 10 passengers and entered civilian service as HE111C version. Meanwhile, the V1, V3 and V5 prototypes with refined wings and other improvements were trialed for military use. They had machine guns added at the nose, the top and the bottom. The last one was quite a strange dustbin type retractable gun position, basically an open basket with a gun. The 111A0 variants were based on the V3 prototype and used the BMW engines, and they were deemed unsatisfactory, as they were too underpowered and the handling got worse because the nose was extended to accommodate the front machine gun, so they were rejected by the Luftwaffe. 6 of these aircraft were later purchased by the Chinese government, and they saw action in the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. To fix the power issue, the V5 prototypes were using Daimler DB600 engines, which produced 1000 horsepower. These were the base for the HE111B series. The B0 pre-production aircrafts could carry 1500 kg bomb load and had the maximum speed increased to 344 km an hour. The first B version flew autumn 1936, and after the improvements on the B1 variant, the RLM ordered 300 of them, and deliveries on the B model started in 1937. The D series was planned to use the 1047 horsepower DB600GA engines, but those were mostly allocated to Bf109 production, so it was tested with UMO 210G engines, but was found to be underpowered. So this series was skipped for the E variant, which was built with the new stronger UMO 211 engines. The E variant had a bomb capacity of 1700 kg, and later with engine improvements this raised to 2000 kg, and they could reach a top speed of 390 km an hour. Around the time the 111E variant entered production, the RLM started to be interested in the rocket-assisted takeoff methods, to increase the bomb load and shorten the takeoff distance for heavy bombers. Helmut Walter's company developed reusable rocket boosters, which were tested on the 111E model in 1937. The rocket boosters were installed under the wings on the bomber, connected to a control panel where the pilot could initiate the ignition during takeoff. Once the plane was in the air and the fuel in the boosters ran out, they were jettisoned and landed with their own parachute, ready to be refilled and used again. The following F variant introduced revised wings, with straight leading and trailing edges. These were easier to build than the earlier elliptical designs. The P model, introduced in 1938, was the first to feature the stepless cockpit design, and it also featured again stronger Daimler engines and increased defensive armament. Finally, the old dustbin ventral gun position was replaced by a fully enclosed gondola for the gunner. With the improvements, the maximum speed of the aircraft increased to 475 km an hour. Most of the 111s used in World War II and seen in any documentaries are the H models. This was the most produced definitive variant of the bomber. This variant was introduced in 1939, and because the Daimler engine's availability was not certain, this variant again used the UMO 211 engines, producing 1100 horsepower. This variant served all through the war, and went through a lot of improvements during its service. Increased armor and armament, even stronger engines, increased bomb load, external bomb racks, and option for carrying torpedoes. Maybe the most interesting version was the HE 111Z, basically two 111s mated together featuring twin fuselage and 5 engines. Originally they were designed to tow the Me 321 Gigant gliders. Later there were plans to use them for several other roles as well. They could carry the Henschel HS-293 guided anti-ship missiles, or they could be used as long-range heavy bombers, but in the end their combat use were minimal. The HE 111 was 16.4 meters long, with a wingspan of 22.6 meters. It was powered by two UMO 211 engines, producing 1300 horsepower each. It could reach a maximum speed of 440 km an hour, and had a range of 2300 km. The plane's service ceiling was 6500 meters. The usual defensive armament consisted of 7 7.92mm machine guns, though on some models the nose and rear positions were swapped for 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The bomb load was 2000 kg internally, or 3600 kg externally. The first combat use of the HE 111 happened years before World War II, in 1937. In February that year, a decision was made in Germany to send some modern bomber aircraft to the Condor Legion fighting in the Spanish Civil War against the nationalist forces. This was seen as a good opportunity for a field test, to evaluate the planes in combat conditions. In the same year, the early versions also seen combat, when the Chinese deployed the 6 purchased aircraft against the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War. The 111 turned out to be a very good aircraft, and the use in the Spanish Civil War allowed the Germans to gather valuable information in its use. But since the enemy fighters in this conflict were mostly outdated Soviet I-15 and I-16 fighters, which the 111 could either outrun, or if not, its defensive armament was strong enough to fight them off, the results created a false confidence in the bomber and delayed upgrades on it. Only after the experiences in the Polish campaign was the defensive armament increased on the aircraft. After the invasion of Poland and before the Western campaign, the 111s were mainly used against the British Navy. This led to a strange incident in February 1940, when the lack of communication between the German Navy and Air Force resulted in the sinking of 2 German destroyers by a group of 111s. During the Western campaign, the Heinkel 111s again participated in most operations. They could operate mostly free because of the strong fighter presence of the Luftwaffe. They supported ground troops, attacked the rail networks and supply lines. They again performed well, but their light defensive armament started to show its weakness, and their losses were higher than in former campaigns. During the Battle of Britain, the bombers encountered a strong and coordinated air defense the first time, and their weaknesses quickly came to light. The 111's defensive armament proved to be too weak, and the signature glass nose dome on them was the first target for every British fighter aircraft. On the other hand, the battle showed that the 111 was more sturdy than the other German bombers, and could take more damage and still keep flying. The German bomber formations required fighter cover for their attacks to keep the losses down, but the German fighters were not designed for long-range escort, and when flying with the bombers, they only had 10-15 minutes worth of fuel available for dogfights before they had to head back home. At the North African theater and on the Mediterranean, the 111s were used to attack Allied convoys, and they also assisted the attacks against Crete and Malta. The HE 111 was quite successful as a torpedo bomber as well. It was modified for this role in 1941 and was able to carry 2 torpedoes externally. On the Eastern Front, the 111s were again used heavily, not just as tactical bombers, but as transport aircraft as well, flying supplies or troops if needed. Often they were used in low-level attack missions against Soviet forces or trains, but in these missions many of them were lost due to heavy anti-aircraft fire. Though late in the war, the 111s became increasingly less effective and less useful, as the defensive nature of the war required more fighters than bombers. But the Germans kept them in service as they were used in many specialist roles. More than 2,000 V1 flying bombs were launched from these bombers, which carried them over to France and launched towards Britain. These operations were not very successful though, as the bombers had to fly very low to avoid being detected by radar or Allied fighters. They were also used in anti-ship operations against the Soviet Navy, carrying the Heinkel HE S-293 guided missiles and anti-ship radar. The HE S-293 was a very advanced missile. After it was launched, it was controlled from the bomber and guided to the target remotely. Since the missile was launched from 2 to 5 km range, they were equipped with flares, so the crew of the bomber can track the missile on its way to the target. The Heinkel HE G111 was maybe the most prominent German bomber of World War II, used in many roles all through the war. Though newer and better planes were developed during the war, this plane was kept in service as it was easy to produce and proved to be very versatile. Altogether around 7,000 units were produced until 1944, when production was stopped as the German Air Force was on the defensive. After the end of the war, they were still built in Spain under license until 1956. These planes were in service up until the 1960s, some of them until the 1970s, and many of them were used in war movies produced in that time. Chapter 7. The Messerschmitt Me 163. The only operational rocket-powered fighter plane in history, the famous Me 163. It was one of the late-war German wonder weapons, and the first aircraft that exceeded 1,000 km an hour in level flight. It was an interesting design, so let's see how and why it was built. In the late 1930s, there was an increasing interest in the rocket-powered airplane designs in Germany, similarly to the jet engines. The rocket engines offered great performance for a fighter plane, but their short burn time and high fuel consumption was a problem. To counter this, a plane with good gliding capabilities was needed, so it can return to the airfield without engine power. The German Research Institute for Gliding Flight was ordered to build a prototype of the Lippisch Delta IV to test rocket engines. This glider was an unconventional design from Dr. Alexander Lippisch, with no tail and featuring large delta wings. Under the program it was renamed the DFS-39. During the development, Lippisch became concerned that the DFS-39's wing-mounted control surfaces will cause problems at high speeds. They redesigned the plane, keeping the overall shape and large swept wings, but with a single vertical stabilizer on the tail. This new design was named the DFS-194. The original plan was DFS will produce the wings for the aircraft and Heinkel prepares the airframe, but the project suffered from delays and DFS couldn't keep the projected dates. Dr. Lippisch became frustrated and requested that he and his team with the whole project to be transferred to Messerschmitt and continue the work there. The Air Ministry granted his request in January 1939. Though the DFS-194 originally was planned to be a conventional piston-powered aircraft, just as a testbed for later rocket-powered designs, but after the project was moved to Messerschmitt, it was decided the aircraft will be developed as a rocket-powered machine only. The first airframe was completed in early 1940 and was moved to Peenemünde for the installation of the rocket engine and for test flights. The prototype showed excellent flight characteristics and reached 342 miles an hour in level flight. The success of the DFS-194 gave the project a big boost. The first prototype built by Messerschmitt, now renamed Me-163A V1, was completed in early 1941 and began its test flights during the summer. The first tests were just unpowered glide tests. After those, it had its rocket engine installed for powered flights. Though the rocket engines were not very reliable, in October 1941, the V1 prototype exceeded the 1000 km/h level flight speed, setting a new speed record. The performance of the aircraft impressed the ministry so much that they immediately instructed Lippisch to design an upgraded version accommodating a new, more powerful rocket engine that was in development at that time. The work on the Me-163B version started in December 1941. Though the main goal was simplifying the construction for large-scale production, the plane actually ended up as a complete redesign compared to the A model. The main visual differences are a different canopy, the more sloped-top fuselage, and the more pointy nose incorporating a turbine to supply electricity while in flight. The first 30 pre-production Me-163B-0 models were equipped with 20mm cannons. The production variant, the Me-163B-1, featured the 30mm Mk108 cannons, the same weapon that was used on the Me-262 jet fighters. After the B model, there were more upgrades planned for the Me-163, mainly aimed at better fighter performance and longer combat time. The C model featured a bubble canopy for better visibility, a longer fuselage with larger fuel tank which increased the power time to 12 minutes, and a pressurized cockpit so the maximum altitude was raised to 15,850 meters. There was only one prototype built. In 1944, the project was moved to Junkers, where an improvement program was started. The newly planned aircraft featured a retractable tricycle landing gear and even more powerful twin-chamber rocket engines. The result was the Ju-248, which was then renamed Messerschmitt Me-263 when the project was moved back to Messerschmitt. This aircraft never reached production as the war ended, but its plans ended up in Soviet hands and served as a base for the Mikoyan Gurevich I-270. The Germans supplied the Japanese Empire with the Me-163 plans and a fully built plane as well. This inspired the Mitsubishi G8M rocket plane. Several variants were built by the Japanese, and in August 1945 the design was finalized and a full-scale production was almost ready to start, but the war ended, so this Japanese rocket plane never saw action. Although the Me-163 performance was amazing, the rocket engines were still highly unreliable and very dangerous, partly because of the very corrosive and flammable fuel, the so-called C-stuff, and the oxidizer called T-stuff. Because of the failing of fuel lines or other problems, many times the aircrafts caught fire while refueling or when the engine was started. Refueling the Me-163 was a very dangerous task. The fuel and the oxidizer were always delivered in separate tankers. The two vehicles never stayed in the vicinity of the aircraft together or even close to each other. First the truck carrying the fuel approached the aircraft, filled it up, then they left the area. Just after that, the other tanker carrying the oxidizer approached and started the refueling process. All the equipment and the plane's fuel system had to be rinsed after use because of the highly corrosive nature of these materials. An interesting design choice was, to save weight, the Me-163 didn't have an undercarriage. It took off with a jettisonable set of wheels and used a skid for landing. This landing skid was also a problematic part of the aircraft, as sometimes it failed on landing, resulting in pilot injuries or worse, the overturning of the aircraft, which could cause explosion or fires. Another drawback of the skid was the aircraft became immobile after landing. Because the planes couldn't move after landing, the ground crews needed special tractors to retrieve them. several different types of these vehicles were used. They all served the same purpose, lifting the aircraft and carry it back to the hangars. Some of them used hydraulics to lift the aircraft. Others relied on compressed air to lift the fighter off the ground. The Me-163 had great performance for a trade-off of only 8 minutes of fuel on board. It could exceed the speed of 1000 km an hour, though because of control surface compression, it was not recommended to exceed 900 km an hour. Its rate of climb was unbelievable for the time, at 81 meters per second. For a comparison, the P-51 Mustang's climb rate was 16 meters per second. From a standing start, it could reach altitudes of 6000 meters or 20,000 feet in less than 2.5 minutes, and 10,000 meters or 33,000 feet in less than 3.5 minutes. The usual method for the Me-163 combat mission was to take off, level out the aircraft and reach around 700 km an hour, which was the plane's best climbing speed, then climb at 70° angle to the target bomber formation's altitude. When reaching the altitude, accelerate to around 850 km an hour. The Me-163 was equipped with two 30mm Mk108 cannons, which was a devastating weapon, but it had low muzzle velocity, so aiming was very hard. The Me-163 pilots had the same difficulties as the ones flying the Me-262 using the same guns. The speed difference between these fighters and the target bombers was huge, so the pilots only had a few seconds to aim their shots, which combined with the low velocity cannons made the attacks very challenging. To test the Me-163, the first service test unit, Erprobungskommando 16, was established late 1942 under the command of Wolfgang Spate. They received their first A model aircrafts in July 1943. The first B models were assigned to this unit in January 1944, and the unit was considered combat ready in May, when they started flying small-scale combat actions against Allied bombing formations. Following these combat trials, the first Luftwaffe Me-163 fighter wing was formed officially. The first combat action of this new fighter wing occurred on 28 of July 1944, when they attacked the B-17 formation. The Allied fighter pilots were stunned by the sheer speed of the Me-163 at first, but after a while they found the German plane's weakness, the very short powered flight time. After the Allied pilots learned about the faults of these new planes, they usually didn't try to attack them directly. Instead, they waited and attacked them in their gliding phase or after landing. By the end of 1944, the fighter wing received 91 Me-163 fighters, but most of them were grounded because of the lack of fuel. The initial plan was to station numerous Me-163 wings around Allied targets, but by the end of the year it was clear this can't be realized due to lack of resources. The fighter wing flew combat missions up until early 1945, but then the Me-163 operations were stopped altogether. Most of their pilots were redirected to Me-262 flights. The Me-163 Comet was not an operational success. It could have worked if used as originally planned, launching a large number of planes against the enemy formations, but at the end of the war, Germany didn't have the resources to use them as they were planned. The Allied nations captured several Me-163s at the end of the war. They tested them, but only in glider mode, as it was deemed too dangerous to test them with the rocket engine. The only exception was a flight by Captain Eric Brown, British Chief Naval Test Pilot. This flight was unofficially conducted in Germany with the help of a cooperating German ground crew on 17th of May 1945. Captain Brown actually signed a disclaimer for the German crew, as they feared retaliation if anything would happen to Brown in the test flight. Despite the fears, the flight went smoothly, and Captain Brown reached 32,000 feet altitude in just 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Later he described the flight as like being in charge of a runaway train. This was the only powered Me-163 flight after the end of the war. As with most of the late war German wonder weapons, the Me-163 was a great technological feat, but it was too little too late to have any impact on the outcome of the war. Chapter 8. The Messerschmitt Me 321 and Me 323. These were the biggest cargo aircraft of World War II, and they started their life as gliders to carry troops and equipment in the planned invasion of Britain. They were used in many roles during the war, and were great propaganda assets for the German media. So today we will take a look at the Messerschmitt Me 321 and Me 323 transport aircrafts. After the fall of France in 1940, Hitler's eyes turned towards Britain. Because the British, despite the increased pressure, showed no willingness to negotiate, on 16th of July, Hitler issued Directive 16, setting the planning of Operation Sea Lion in motion. For the operation to succeed, the directive pointed out several conditions. Germany needed total air superiority, full control of the English Channel, and the Royal Navy had to be so preoccupied in the North Sea and the Mediterranean that they cannot intervene in an invasion. During the planning, it was realized that the current transport aircrafts didn't have enough capacity for an invasion of this scale. So what do you do if you need lots of large capacity aircrafts for an operation like this, preferably built fast and cheap? You look into gliders, which can be built from cheap materials, doesn't require engines and lots of maintenance, and one towing aircraft can make several turns, towing and releasing them towards their target. Though gliders were in military use well before World War II, they were mostly smaller in size and could only carry a handful of men and no heavy equipment. The DFS-230, though it was a capable glider, was only able to carry 9 men, and though it was used successfully during the war in many operations, like the Battle of Crete or the rescuing of Benito Mussolini, it was not designed for a large-scale operation like the invasion of Britain would be. The GO-242 was designed to replace the DFS-230. It was bigger and could carry 20 men, but it was still too small and light to be used in a huge operation like the one the Germans planned. So in October 1940, the Luftwaffe Technical Bureau issued a tender for a large-capacity cargo glider, and sent it to Junkers and Messerschmitt, and they were given 14 days to submit their designs. The requirements, compared to the earlier gliders, were very ambitious and envisioned enormous aircrafts. They asked for the ability to carry either a Panzer IV medium tank, or an 88mm gun and a half-track truck, or entire companies of men. That meant around 25 tons of cargo capacity. And the gliders would have to be built from non-strategic materials. The tender was named Project Warsaw, and the Junkers design was given the Warsaw Ost, and the Messerschmitt design the Warsaw Süd codename. Both companies entered their design for this tender. Junkers with the Ju-322 and Messerschmitt with the Me-321, which was originally called Me-263, but later renamed to 321. Though Operation Sea Lion was abandoned in December 1940, it was never officially cancelled. The work on the big assault gliders continued. Junkers designed the Ju-322 Mammoth, an all-wooden glider with a length of 30.2 meters and a wingspan of 62 meters, with a capacity of carrying 140 fully equipped troops or 20,000 kilograms of cargo. But the all-wood construction caused troubles for Junkers, as it turned out the design was not strong enough, so cargo capacity was limited to 12,000 kilograms. Its maiden flight was not very successful either. In April 1941, towed by a 4-engine Ju-90 transport aircraft, it took off but turned out to be very unstable, and with its huge wing area, it gained altitude faster than a towing aircraft. It had to be released prematurely, and although it managed to glide without an incident, it landed on a field and took weeks to recover due to its size. Because of its instability and the overall weak construction, the project was dropped a month later, although improvements were planned to correct the faults. The Messerschmitt design fared much better. It had a steel tube frame design with wooden wings and fabric covering. Its size was almost the same as the Junkers design, with a length of 28 meters and a wingspan of 55 meters. With these dimensions, both designs were comparable in size to a B-29 bomber. The cargo space on the Me-231 was designed to the same dimensions as a railway car, so it could take any load delivered on train and featured a front loading ramp. The Messerschmitt glider made its maiden flight in February 1941 without any incidents. The only problem found was that the controls were very heavy and sluggish, but Messerschmitt fixed this problem fitting electric servos to assist and adding dual controls and the co-pilot position. The takeoff procedure, on the other hand, was troublesome for the massive aircraft. The originally planned Ju-90 aircrafts were not powerful enough to tow a loaded glider, so the Germans came up with the idea to use 3 Bf-110 twin-engined heavy fighters in a V formation. Reusable rocket boosters were also used on the glider to help with the takeoff. These were ignited during the takeoff procedure, and as the aircraft gained altitude, they were jettisoned and landed with their own parachute. Towing the massive glider with 3 aircraft was highly dangerous, as any error meant a huge accident, and it wouldn't take long for this accident to happen. In 1941, a malfunction on takeoff led to the collision of the towing planes, and eventually the death of all the crews and passengers on all 4 planes, altogether 129 men. During one of his visits at the Heinkel factory, Ernst Udet requested Heinkel to come up with a solution, which led to the design of the HG-111Z plane, which was basically 2 HG-111 bombers mated together, featuring a double fuselage and 5 engines. But these newly developed Heinkel planes were not available in big numbers, and when these giant gliders were towed by the Bf-110s, the range was unsatisfactory. Even when used with the new HG-111 twin aircrafts, the biggest problems with the gliders weren't addressed. Lacking their own power, if they made a mistake approaching an airfield, they couldn't go around and try again, and after landing they were unable to move. So in early 1942, a decision was made to develop a motorized version of the giant plane. This was the Me-323. Actually, plans to build a motorized version were in talks right after the production of the Me-321 was approved, but they only started to materialize in 1942. To avoid putting additional stress to the German industry, the plans used French 14-cylinder engines on this aircraft. The first trials were conducted with using only 4 engines installed. This configuration solved some of the problems. The new plane could taxi on the ground, and it could fly empty, but it wasn't powerful enough to take off when loaded. It still needed towing planes and rocket boosters to get off the ground. So the V2 variant was created using 6 engines, and these became the base for the Me-323D series. This variant had a 12-ton payload, though many times they flew with more than that. The Me-323 had 2 flight engineers on board in different stations, one in each wing monitoring the engines. During its production, the Me-323 went through several variants, featuring different engine, armament, and other modifications. For example, starting with the E variant, gun turrets were built in the wings to increase defensive armament. There were some interesting experimental versions, like the Me-323 E2 WT, where the WT stands for Waffenträger, weapons carrier. This variant didn't carry any cargo. It was intended as a heavily armed gunship variant to protect the other planes. It featured 20mm cannons, additional turrets and armor plating, and more machine gun posts, including another 2 turrets in the wings. 2 prototypes were built, but in the end it didn't go to production. The other interesting variant was the Me-323Z, which was a twin variant just like the HG-111Z, featuring dual fuselage joined at the wing. The Me-321 and 323 both were 28.2 meters long with a wingspan of 55.2 meters. The Me-321 had a cargo capacity of 20,000 kilograms, while the 323 could carry 12,000 kilograms. The Me-321 had a maximum tow speed of 180 kilometers an hour, and its range depended on the towing aircraft. The 323 used 6 14-cylinder engines, each of them producing 1,180 horsepower. Had a maximum speed of 285 kilometers an hour, a range of 800 kilometers, and a service ceiling of 4,000 meters. The first Me-321 entered service in May 1941. First towed by the triple Bf mountain setups, which, as we mentioned earlier, was very dangerous and caused a huge accident costing 129 lives. In July the same year, some Me-321s were transferred to the Eastern Front, but even to get there, they had to make 4 or 5 stops because of the short range of the towing aircrafts. As it turned out, they were not very useful on the Eastern Front. When the airfields got too muddy, they couldn't even take off. And the earlier mentioned problems, like the lack of own power to taxi on the ground, too short range, and dangerous towing setup caused all kinds of problems. So early 1942 they were withdrawn from the East, and later planned to participate in several operations, like the invasion of Malta, but their part was cancelled because of the lack of towing aircraft. In 1943 they were sent to the Eastern Front again during the Battle of Stalingrad, but there were no airfields in good enough shape to accommodate them by the time they got there, so they were pulled back again. Finally, in December 1943, the Heavy Glider Command was disbanded altogether. Some of the gliders were converted to Me-323s, but most of them were scrapped. The first Me-323 group was organized in Leipheim in 1942, and then moved to Greece and later to Italy near Naples. Because German and Italian shipping suffered heavy losses on the Mediterranean, they started delivering cargo to the Africa Corps, flying to Tunis and Bizerta. They carried mostly weapons, armored vehicles, and oversized cargo, and on the way back wounded and prisoners. The slow and huge planes became juicy targets for the Allied fighters, but usually, though they were quite defenseless, they were not easy to shut down, as most of the insides were empty space, that is, until they started carrying ammunition and fuel, when suddenly they became very vulnerable. Some of them were lost during these operations, but the greatest loss happened on 22nd of April 1943, when 27 of them were flying, loaded with cargo under fighter escort, when they were attacked by Allied fighters. In the following air battle, 16 of these slow giants were shot down and lost, together with 119 men. That was almost 10% of the total of these aircrafts built, lost in just one day, as during the war only 198 of them were built. After the Allied attack on Italy, they were transferred to Poland and started delivering cargo on the Eastern Front. Their losses started to mount here, thanks to flying missions back to back and the worsening situation in the air as the Luftwaffe grew weaker. By the end of the war, most of them were destroyed, many blown up by the Germans on the ground when they couldn't get away from approaching Soviet forces, because lack of fuel, or if the airfields were not in good enough shape for them to take off. Sadly, none of them survived the war. Only some parts can be found in various museums. That is all that's left from these giants of the sky, the biggest cargo plane of World War II. Chapter 9. The Messerschmitt Me-262. The most famous and notorious jet fighter of World War II, the wonder weapon of Hitler, the Me-262, a familiar sight for many. It was a revolutionary jump in aviation technology and influenced plane designs well after the war. To understand the origins of the Me-262, we need to go back to the pre-war years, the 1930s, when jet engine development first got to the point when they were actually usable. Well before World War II, engineers were concerned that the propeller-driven planes will reach their limits soon because of the propeller's efficiency. Although even up to the end of World War II, the propeller-driven plane designs kept getting faster and better, it was clear they will reach the end of their life soon. The first jet engine designs were kind of hybrids, where the air compressor was driven by an external piston engine, as opposed to a real jet engine, where the compressor is driven by the engine itself. A good example for these early hybrid experiments is the Caproni Campini N1. The first actual patent for an engine using a gas turbine was filed in 1921, but that engine was never built. The man known as pioneer for the jet engine was Frank Whittle, who had the idea for a turbojet engine in 1928 and submitted his patent in 1930. About the same time when Frank Whittle was working on his turbojet engine in Britain, there were similar experiments in Germany by Hans von Wachin. His first working jet engine was running in September 1937, just 6 months after Whittle's. A version of this engine powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE 178, in August 1939, just a few weeks before the invasion of Poland. Encouraged by the successful tests, the Germans started working on the idea of an advanced combat aircraft powered by jet engines. Unlike the British, who at the beginning neglected Whittle's jet engine, the Germans were very interested in the new technology. Because it only appeared at the end of the war, many think it was just one of the last attempt wonder weapons. But actually the Me-262, under the name Project 1065, was already under development before the beginning of World War II. The main goal for the project was to create a jet-powered aircraft capable of speeds above 850 km an hour. By mid-1939, the first design was drawn up and submitted. It was slightly different from the final design, but not by much. The biggest difference being the first design featured wing root mounted engines instead of engine pods under the wings. Not a well-known fact, but by this time the Germans had a jet fighter in a much more advanced stage. It was the Heinkel HE-280, which by September 1940 was in a stage where the first airframe was already completed. The main problem with the Heinkel plane was, as expected, the engines. Heinkel tried to build his own jet engines in-house by employing Hans von Wachin. However, the engine development was well behind the projected pace, and through 1940 and 1941 the plane's test flights were mainly done in glider mode. There were even proposals to use the pulse jet engines from the WWII rockets on the aircraft. Finally, at the end of 1942, the HE-280 demonstrated itself with jet engines against the Focke-Wulf 190. The test showed that it was a lot faster than the propeller-driven fighter. But the engine problem still delayed the Heinkel project. Finally, in 1943, the aircraft was tested with the UMO jet engines and worked well enough. But the UMO engines were much bigger and heavier than the ones the plane was designed for, so this prototype was much slower than the Me-262. In March 1943, Heinkel was ordered to stop the project, as the ministry didn't want two competing designs for the limited number of jet engines. So after this little detour, back to the Me-262 development. As opposed to the first plan, later the engines were moved out to the engine pods under the wings. This was important for easier access, as the early jet engines were not exactly durable. The engine development and manufacturing during the war continued to be the biggest problem for the jet fighter project. Many high-ranking officials were convinced the war could be won easily with conventional aircraft. Hermann Göring cut back the jet engine development program to just 35 engineers. Don't forget, we are talking about the first half of the war, when Germany ruled most of Europe and confidence was all-time high. The Me-262 is known as the first swept-wing fighter aircraft, though the swept wing was not actually in the initial plans. The main reason the plane had swept wings was because the jet engines were heavier than originally planned. To keep the weight in the correct position, the wings were swept back, so the airframe doesn't need to be modified to move the whole wing further back. On the first 5 prototypes, only the outer edge of the wings were swept, and the inner part between the fuselage and the engine nacelles remained straight. Later wing tunnel tests showed the advantage of a full swept design, so from the V6 prototype onwards, all models have the signature 18.5 degree swept wings. Test flights began on 18th of April 1941 with the V1 prototype, although jet engines were not ready at the time, so a conventional piston engine was installed in the nose. This conventional engine was still retained after the jet engines were installed, and this saved the prototype actually, when in a test flight both jets flamed out. The first only jet-powered flight came with the V3 prototype on 18th of July 1942. This is the flight you see in the background footage. Those of you who are familiar with the Me-262 probably noticed that the plane in the footage has a tailwheel. Up until the V4 prototype, all the Me-262s were built with a conventional tailwheel setup. This was found to be a problem as the jet exhaust deflected up from the runway and interfered with the elevators on takeoff. On the V5 model they switched to a fixed tricycle landing gear, and on the V6 to a fully retractable tricycle gear setup. This was then retained all the way in production. Test flights continued over the coming years, but the problems with the jet engines slowed down the project considerably. Germany had a shortage of metals needed to withstand the extreme heat and pressure in the jet engines, so early engines were so short-lived they often only lasted for one flight. Although the airframe was basically ready by 1942, the lack of engines available prevented mass production until 1944. To overcome this, German engineers changed most of the rare materials in the engines to mild steel with aluminum coating. With this they simplified production, but it was a big compromise as the turbines in the engines only lasted for about 30 hours. The Me-262 featured two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines. The aircraft had a maximum speed of 900 km an hour, which equals approximately 560 miles an hour. This was more than 100 miles an hour more than most Allied fighter aircrafts of the time were capable of. The P-51 had a maximum speed of 710 km an hour, and the P-47 could reach only 686 km an hour. The Me-262 had a cruise speed of 465 miles an hour, and even this was higher than the maximum speed of most propeller-driven fighters of World War II. The plane's maximum range was 650 miles, though because of the engine's high fuel consumption and inconsistency, a low fuel warning light was installed to warn the pilot if the remaining fuel is below 250 liters. The service ceiling was 37,570 feet. The Me-262's speed and climb rate was very impressive at that time and came as a shock to the Allied pilots. The armament on the fighter was equally impressive. It featured four 30mm Mk108 cannons installed in the nose. This was a devastating weapon. A few of its rounds could tear off the wing of a B-17 or blow a smaller aircraft to pieces. The A-2 fighter bomber version only featured two cannons, but could be equipped with 250 or 500 kg bombs. There were several experiments to utilize the Me-262 for various roles, so let's take a look at the most interesting ones. The 1A/U4 was a proposed bomber tankbuster version with a 50mm cannon in the nose. The Me-262B2 was a proposed night fighter version with a stretched fuselage. The A1/U3 was a reconnaissance version. As the Me-262 only arrived at the end of the war, its operation history wasn't too long. A test unit was set up in April 1944 to train pilots and introduce the plane into service. The actual operational missions for the Me-262 started in August 1944. During the second half of the year, the new jet started to fly combat missions, but not in large scale, as the Luftwaffe was still in the process of working out fighter tactics for the new planes and setting up units. Because of the speed of the Me-262, the pilots needed new tactics to attack bomber formations, as their speed difference was too big for accurate shooting, especially in a head-on attack. A favored method became a shallow dive from the rear below the formation, then pulling up to attack from below, then turn away. The first dedicated bomber unit using the 2A variant fighter bombers was set up in January 1945. They didn't manage to achieve any big results, but lost 12 planes in a short time. It was in March 1945 when these new jets were first used in large scale. On 18th of March, 37 Me-262s attacked the formation of more than 1200 bombers. They claimed 13 kills against the loss of 3 Me-262s. Though they were successful planes and had a good kill ratio, because of their low numbers at this stage of the war, they barely made an impact. During the last days of the war, the Me-262s were mainly directed to ground attack role against the Red Army, just outside Berlin. They claimed several ground targets and aircraft kills, but it was too little, too late. After the end of World War II, the Allied countries tried to gather as much of the advanced German technologies as they could. During Operation Lusty, many of the Me-262s and other German aircraft were confiscated and shipped to the US for evaluation. During the testing they found the Me-262 was faster than the Gloucester Meteor, had better visibility, and it was a more stable gun platform, but its engine was less reliable. Even compared to the P-80 Shooting Star, they found that the German plane had better acceleration and speed. From the test they got many innovative ideas. For example, the slats on the F-86 Sabre were based on the Me-262s. Czechoslovakia produced Me-262s after World War II, and they were the first aircraft of their air force. They stayed in service until 1951, when Soviet fighters replaced them. The Me-262 was a big jump in aviation technology and influenced several post-war designs. like the Sukhoi Su-9, the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15 and even the B-47 Stratojet.